installing View Transfer Server, and managing local mode VMs. Yeah, this is another one of those sort of interesting topics. The ones where it's hard to provide any good guidance because the the answers or the decisions about whether or not you're going to implement something like this is really going to depend on, again, what your use case is between you and your users. So the View Transfer Server and local mode VMs are in many ways kind of a special case in the whole VDI deployment of desktops. Okay, now think about VDI, right? So in the beginning, VDI was designed as a mechanism to get users away from their local desktops. By moving those desktops out into the data center, there are potentially some optimizations that one can get, particularly when desktops are similarly configured. So local mode VMs presents a way to kind of reverse that flow back down to those local pieces of hardware once again. And so the question is kind of begged, I think, before you even decide whether this nugget and this feature is worthwhile for you, you kind of have to think about whether you even need local mode VMs or offline VDI. You know, are your users going to have the need to make use of whatever infrastructure you've built in your data center on their local computers, running on their local processors, and potentially removed from all the services that make up your data center? You know, if those machines need to connect back up into servers that may exist in the data center, if they're going to pull them off on a laptop out into the world somewhere, well, that laptop still has to have the network connectivity to get the clients connected up to the servers. So there's a huge question here as to whether or not offline VDI is even something you want to do. Now, let's assume that it is. Okay, let's assume that you do have a use case where users that have a need to pull off a copy of their virtual desktop so that they can work on it elsewhere is something that's in your list of requirements. Well, there are some additional considerations that you have to think about whenever you're going about enabling those local mode virtual machines, right? When those virtual machines are in local mode, they are no longer directly attached into your data center. Okay, so they may not have network connectivity enough to authenticate to Active Directory, assuming they're out at a coffee shop somewhere or at an airport somewhere. They may not have the network connectivity they need to connect up whatever their client applications are off onto server applications. They may even have different network configurations that you may not have even thought about whenever you were creating the initial VDI infrastructure. So when you are considering making available a View Transfer Server and making available local mode VMs, well, pay particular attention to how you configure those virtual machines so that when they are out in the world, they'll have whatever networking connectivity that they require. Okay, so that's just kind of a high-level suggestion there because these things can exist in various locations. Now, all right, so again, assuming that you have decided that this is something that you want to do. Okay, you want to distribute the processing of your virtual machines away from the data center and then back onto the individual devices. You think about it, there's a lot more processors sitting out in those individual devices than are there probably inside of the data center. So this whole idea presents a notion of redistributing out a very defined user to computer experience out onto the laptop and desktop processors that exist out there. So assuming that you have decided that, well, what do you need to do? VMware View has this thing called a View Transfer Server and also a Transfer Server repository. And both of these elements are designed to facilitate the transfer of that virtual machine from the data center off onto the client. Okay, a View Transfer Server is a glorified View connection server with a couple of additional features. Interestingly enough, though, even though it is kind of a glorified connection server, there are a couple of configurations that you have to be very cautious about whenever you go about setting one up. So in this nugget, we're going to talk about, all right, well, what is the View Transfer Server and what is the Transfer Server repository and how do you go about all those activities in managing those local mode VMs? So let's start by, I'm going to minimize this here, and we're taking a look once again at our VMware View Administrator console. We are on vcon.company.pri. And for us to make use of a View Transfer Server, one of the things we have to do is obviously get it installed. Okay, so down here under Servers, there is an element here under the Servers node that we haven't looked at before, and that's the Transfer Servers sort of screen down here at the bottom. And here in a minute, we're actually going to click this Add button and actually connect up to the View Transfer Server that or the server that we've installed View Transfer Server onto. Interestingly enough, so in order to support Transfer Server, that Transfer Server actually needs to be a virtual machine that exists on a vCenter server that's already been attached to VMware View. Okay, so if you tried to create this as another server, you're going to have a problem. Now, most of us are probably virtualizing our assets anyway, but just be conscious of this because it's expecting this transfer server to exist on one of your vCenter servers. So here we are. Back on the other server, vc.company.pri. And as you can see here, we've got VM-001, that virtual desktop, that's up and running. I've powered off 002 so I can open up enough resources to support this Windows Server instance, vtrans.company.pri. I've got to stop here for a minute and just kind of so as a complete aside, you have to kind of recognize the level of resources that are required to get all of these pieces of equipment running on the same desktop. Let's see, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 virtual machines running, of which 2 nested virtual machines are running in addition to the desktop, in addition to Outlook. So there's a whole lot of stuff going on right here. And if you're following along at home, make sure you have plenty of resources in order to supply all of this equipment with the things that are necessary to get all these VMs up and running. What is this machine? This is a 4-way Intel i7 2600K with 16 gigs of RAM. So lots and lots of, and SSD, 2 SSDs in fact. So lots of equipment are required to get all this stuff up and running. That said, all right, so we have this vtrans.company.pri server. In fact, I've remoted that server here. We're taking a look at it via RDC just because it makes things easier to work with than that little window there in the lower right. So here's vtrans.company.pri. I have here the View Connection Server bits that I've downloaded from vmware.com. We're going to go through the installation of VMware View Connection Server, or View Transfer Server. One of the interesting prerequisites that you may not find until perhaps too late, it has to do with the type of SCSI controller that is used for exposing the disks to this virtual machine. Okay. Before I actually get into this installation, I want to flip back here to our vSphere client because this is actually important because it may actually trip you up whenever you're creating the virtual machine. So for this virtual machine here, if I take a look at the settings, you should notice that the SCSI controller for this virtual machine is not the default LSI Logic SAS controller, but is instead the LSI Logic Parallel controller. The LSI Logic SAS controller is not supported for use for this View Transfer Server. So be conscious of that because it bit me and I had to go and make some changes in this in order to make the View Transfer Server function for this nugget. Anyway, create that virtual machine, make sure you've got the right SCSI controller, launch the View Connection Server installation wizard, go through all the usual settings, put it in the usual location, and here we are back at the installation options screen. I told you we would be seeing at least 3 of these 4 throughout this series, and now we're going to get a chance to take a look at the View Transfer Server. So let's install that View Transfer Server here. Not much to look at. Okay, what's the domain? What is the server name? And what is the administrator's email address? This is merely for the Apache installation that's going to be used for facilitating that transfer of those virtual machine disk files. Okay, VMware View loves Apache, so this is for that Apache installation. Hit Next. We are going to configure the Windows Firewall automatically because we have to open up the correct ports, and we're going to install it to the proper location. Again, not much. VMware's done a really good job of eliminating a lot of the complexity with these installations. And so thankfully, creating a new transfer server doesn't take that much effort. Okay. Once the View Transfer Server installation has completed, okay, we hit the Finish button here and we recognize that that's all done. There's still a little effort that's required. Okay, I'm going to go back here, not to VC, but to vcon.company.pri. And we're going to add in a new transfer server. Okay, I'm going to hit the Add button here. I'm going to choose the vCenter server, vc.company.pri, and I'm going to look for the virtual machine that it recognizes has been configured as a transfer server. You can see that this is right here. Okay, hit the Finish button. And this completes the connection between VMware View, or the initial VMware View connection server, and that View transfer server. So as you can see, after a second or two, the status here changes from pending to the fact that it's missing a transfer server repository. Okay, so the transfer server is the server that facilitates the communication, but there still needs to be a location where we can store some of the source files for these virtual machines. Okay, some of the initial replica files, just like what we were talking about a few nuggets ago. That will be the location where people grab stuff and then download it. You'll notice up here that it says the transfer server repository is not configured at present. Okay, for us, once the server's been connected to, for us to actually create a transfer server repository, one of the first things we have to do is actually put the transfer server into maintenance mode. Okay, once we put the transfer server into maintenance mode, that kind of opens up where we're going to locate this repository. So let me go back to here into servers. I'm going to grab this server here, vtrans.company.pri, put it into maintenance mode. This maintenance mode ensures that there aren't going to be any clients that are attempting to connect to the server that are going to attempt to either replicate their existing stuff or download an initial copy. So it kind of puts things in pause so that I can go about changing where this transfer server repository is. Once I do that, then I can choose either a network share or a local file system location for where I'm going to store that information. Now on this server vcon.company.pri, there's not a lot of options here for storing stuff. Okay, I've got a C drive and that's about it. But let's make use of the C drive that I have. Okay, I'll just create a folder here called transfer. And in the C transfer location, that's going to be, well, where we want to end up putting the data the transfer server will actually manage. Okay, let me go back here to edit. I'm going to choose local file system and this C:\transfer location. All right, that identifies the repository. Once the repository is identified, then I have to actually push some data out to it. It is via this publish item that I'm actually going to push out the data that users will eventually download. Now, I can't do it right now. There are no transfers currently working properly to actually publish the stuff. So what I want to do is go back here to servers once again, take this machine, send it out of maintenance mode. Okay, so I'm now functioning as a real transfer server again. Wait for that server's status to leave the pending status. And then once it switches from pending to ready, that means that I'm now ready to actually go about publishing out that transfer server information to the repository. It's at this point where, if you remember in the introduction to this nugget, where I talked about how we have to sort of manage for local mode, that some of the decisions that you've been making up until this point have important impacts on how or whether or not users are going to be able to make use of their local mode images. So let me click the Publish button here, and I want you to notice something. Wait a minute, where are the View Composer images that are available to publish? Shouldn't there be, don't we have that pool that we created earlier? Well, as you can imagine, some of these pools are not actually supported for use in local mode. And in fact, the pool that we created before, well, that pool is one of those that indeed isn't available. Part of the reason is because it's set up as a floating pool. Let me show you back here under the, not here, under the Pools node, how you can create a pool that supports local mode. And this just goes right back to those supported features down here on the lower right that we pointed out, or I pointed out to you a number of nuggets ago, but you have to be very conscious about the decisions, again, that you make. Okay, again, we want to create an automated pool. Love the automated pools. Still in support of View Composer. Now, the last time that we went about making the selection here for user assignment, we switched things up to the floating mode. But you'll notice that setting things to floating mode eliminates the support for local mode. So you can't really have a floating pool that supports local mode access. Okay, that's kind of the big important recognition here, is that you have to have a dedicated pool, and you either can, in this case, or if you can't, in that case, in either case, support local mode whenever you have a dedicated pool. Okay, that's important to recognize. So with this new pool, we can go about going through all the settings that we did before, setting view composer link clones here. In this case, we'll call it link clones dedicated instead of just link clones because we have that dedicated pool. We can set the pool settings just like we did before. In this case, get the option of setting a disposable file right here for redirecting those disposable files to non-persistent disks. And I also have the ability to redirect the Windows profile to a persistent disk if I want. Okay, this again gives you the ability, because this is a dedicated virtual machine, to ensure that that user's profile gets either separated or not separated based on what your selection is here. Again, all of these still support that use of local mode. I can use a naming pattern here. I'll do VM dash, we'll do dedicated, and then let's see, what was that? N colon fixed equals 3, and then close curly bracket. I'll create 2 desktops, provision them on demand, and keep one of them powered on. Okay, so now I have all the settings here correct. Go back here into my vCenter settings, find that parent VM again. That parent VM can still be the Windows 7 template. Perfectly fine for us to use that Windows 7 template, and perfectly fine for us to use either of the snapshots associated with that template. I can even put it into whatever locations I had for the other virtual machines. Same host or cluster, same resource group as before. Or I can split them out as I see fit. Okay, in this case, I'm just, again, making things relatively easy on myself by selecting these in this way. I'm going to choose VM2 because I've got plenty of space there. And choose Next. The guest customization is going to put things into my linked clones location, just like before. Okay, down here under View Desktops and Link Clone Desktops. And then finally Next, and then Finish. Okay, so as I said, you have to make some very intelligent decisions about the types of pools that you intend to create and the features that those pools are intended to support. Because, well, if you want to be able to add local mode, well, there is this giant sort of if-then matrix that you have to support in order to do that. So this whole process is going to go about creating another pool of virtual machines. And this can take a minute or two. So I'm going to pause the recording one more time. When we come back, we will have a dedicated pool. Then I can show you from the client-side perspective what this looks like. And we're back. So there are actually a couple of things that got accomplished before the break and now here after the break. The first of which is obviously creating this new linked clones dedicated pool. Okay, this is the other pool that was created so that we could make use of these virtual machines offline. The second thing I did, just to kind of speed things up, was down here under servers. And so after creating the new pool, well, the next step in the process is then to publish that pool up here to the repository. Doing so is literally just clicking this button and then choosing the image you want to publish and clicking OK. So we saw this before, and the only difference between, well, what happened between the break and now and the previous time before when things didn't appear was that this item appeared here that you're now seeing down here. So we have now an image that's been published to this transfer server repository. With all of this now configured, well, we can make some changes to these pools in order to make them available for use in local mode. The first thing I want to do is go back up here to Pools and then take a look here at the Linked Clones dedicated pool. Okay, really same sorts of things that we were working with before. You've got to entitle the pool. You've got to set up its characteristics for how users will interact with it. However, there's one thing that's different whenever you're working with local mode, and that is actually identifying what the local mode policies are for this virtual machine, or this pool of virtual machines. Now, just like the view policies, these policies can be set either as global policies, or they can be set by the individual virtual desktop pool. And if I take a look, actually, let's start down here under Global Policies. If I take a look under Global Policies and choose to edit the policies, you'll see that there are a number of different items that we can take a look at. The first is, do you even want to allow local mode to exist? Okay, yes or no. The second here suggests whether or not you want the users to be given the privilege to actually roll back their virtual machines. So if something happens on that user's virtual machine after they've downloaded it, well, are they allowed to roll that virtual machine back to a previous state to get themselves back up and running again? Do you want to set a certain amount of time, a maximum amount of time that that virtual machine can operate without being able to contact a server? Now you think about this, if the user's out working in the airports and the hotels of the world, well, they may be gone for more than 7 days. You might want to increase this to a larger number of days if you expect these virtual machines to be out of contact for any period of time. As we'll find out here in just a minute, there is also the ability to replicate the virtual machines that are down at the client side back up here with the server. Okay, we can choose whether or not we want to set a replication frequency after a certain number of hours or a certain number of days or a certain number of minutes. What this will do is replicate again the information that's down at that user's location. It will replicate that information back up to the server so that we have consistency between what's available at the repository and then what's available down there with the users. This is again useful in case that user should lose their virtual machine or if they should lose the hardware that virtual machine is operating on. This will indeed create a replication interval of a certain number of hours or days in order to enable that replication to occur. Now the users, depending on how you set up these policies, can either choose to replicate or you can enforce that replication to occur. In fact, there is the option down here to select whether you want the users to defer the replication. Okay, maybe they're on a really slow link and that replication process is going to take a long period of time, so you don't want to do that. The replication that typically occurs are the persistent disks. So the operating system disk, depending on how you set it up, generally isn't going to change all that much. But the persistent disks associated with that operating system disk are the ones that are probably going to have all the changes that occur. Again, these are the user disk, the user state data. So you can actually set up for OS or OS and persistent disks, but typically the types of disks that you're going to want to replicate back up are going to be those that are just containing the user data you need to save. Do we want to allow a user-initiated check-in of the virtual machine? So can the user actually check back in that virtual machine whenever they want, whenever they're done with using it? And can you allow user-initiated replication to occur? So all of these, again, are local mode policies. They can be set here at the global side. They can be set, once again, here in the pool side. And again, they're designed so that when the users go about that check-in, check-out process, that they have a consistent experience with all the different desktop pools that you're working with. Now, there is one other thing that we have to do in order to support this local mode, and this is back here on the client computer. So we created this new desktop pool. Okay, and this new desktop pool is available for both online use back in the data center and then also for offline use via this checkout process. But the VMware View client version that we actually installed is not the right version that supports offline mode. So you'll see here I brought up all the list of the various things I've downloaded from VMware's website, and we started by downloading and installing the VMware View client. This is this instance right here. However, there is also this client with local mode that we kind of skipped over in the last instance. Now, what's useful about these two clients is the fact that running the VMware View client with local mode does not necessarily require an uninstallation of the regular client. In fact, if I go here and attempt to run the VMware View client with local mode, what it's going to do is give me the option to modify or repair the existing installation of that VMware View client and simply allow me to add the feature, which is the VMware View client with local mode. Now, this VMware View client, interestingly enough, the local mode client here does not actually function inside of a virtual machine. And so this whole environment that I've got built up here is a virtual machine-oriented environment. So the idea here is that VMware View does not want you creating these nested virtual machines with a virtual machine operating within a virtual machine. So the client experience is nothing I'm going to be able to show you here in this demonstration, but I want you to get the understanding that, well, this is the process you would go through for installing that VMware View client with local mode. Once the client is installed, the client can then go about downloading that instance or an instance of the virtual machine that's in the pool. Once that instance of the virtual machine has been downloaded, those sessions will appear here in the local sessions area under monitoring. Okay, and those local sessions here, all the different desktops from all the different pools and all the different users will identify which virtual machines have been checked out and which ones are being used. Now, when those are checked out, there are two buttons up here that become important, one of which is the Rollback button and the other is the Initiate Replication button. The second of these, the Initiate Replication button, instructs that specific client, whatever one you've highlighted, to go about initiating whatever replication of local information back up here to the server. The first button here, Rollback, tells that client, okay, well, you need to roll back the existing client that you have to whatever the official version of the client is that's up here at the server. So these are all the things you have to be aware of when it comes to local mode. Again, the use of local mode for many environments is going to be one that's, well, is a real question. Right? Whether or not it's important for you to even use local mode, because again, a lot of the applications that you'll be using inside of your virtual desktop environment are those applications that need to talk with server resources. And so you kind of have to make, again, that internal decision as to whether or not you even need local mode VMs or offline VDI. So what have we talked about in this nugget? We've talked about exactly that question. Is local mode important? And if so, well, how do we actually enable it? We talked about some of those considerations for enabling local mode VMs. And then here in the interaction portion, we spent quite a bit of time installing that view transfer server, configuring the server up, configuring the transfer server repository so that we could facilitate the upload and download, the check-in and check-out of virtual machines. And then we spent a minute or two talking about how to manage local mode VMs and all the vagaries of making sure that those virtual machines can be set up appropriately and also replicated appropriately. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.